Senators are gaveled in after meetings with President Obama on the government shutdown and the debt ceiling.
The Senate will come to order. Majority Leader.
Until 6 p.m. be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders, and that the Democrats be limited to 10 minutes each. Basically, the reason for that, Mr. President, is we have lots and lots of speakers on this side, and I need not say more. Ask consent.
Without objection.
President.
The Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're hearing a lot of discussion right now about the role of government, the role of the public sector. We know that there's a minority of the minority in the House of Representatives who ran on shutting the government down, were elected, think they've achieved something as we see the economy teetering now, as we see people who have been put out of work, who have mortgages and car payments and concerns about their children and so on. All the services that are in jeopardy, safety, from food safety to law enforcement to what happens in the case of an oil spill and all of the things in between. And I found it interesting that with our colleagues who have embraced the idea that in the greatest country in the world, in the greatest democracy in the world, that there is no need for the public sector. Now, no one else, by the way, is having this debate around the world. Nobody is having a debate. They are embracing every tool of the public sector to embrace their private sector, to try to beat us by out-educating and out-innovating us in a global economy. And the distinguished senator presiding certainly understands that. So we're in a global race where everybody understands it's all in. We use all the tools that we have. We have the greatest private sector, most robust private sector, entrepreneurs that can beat anybody in the world. But we also have a public sector that creates the framework and support for that by having a rule of law, by having basic protections in place for the public. And as I've had the opportunity to listen to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, particularly in the House, it seems that every time there's a story, salmonella outbreak, gosh, we better bring some folks back. Oh, we have veterans that are hurting. Oh, we better bring something back. We have women and children not getting baby formula through the WIC program. We should do something about that. We have concerns about national safety. We should do something about that. It's almost like we are educating these members about the role of government in this process. As they go, oh, I didn't realize we did that. And so maybe that function ought to be working. It's a chaotic way in which the greatest democracy to operate, but that seems to be what is happening right now. You know, I remember in my times in traveling to China and the last time I was there, where they said to me, "Oh, you're here in Beijing on a great day. You can see across the street." We're lucky. We can see across the street almost every day because we collectively have decided that one of the things that we need to do to be able to breathe the air is to have certain rules, certain protections, standards in place so that we can breathe the air. That's important to do through the public sector. We can't say, I'll do the air in front of this desk, you do the air in front of this desk, somebody else will protect the air over here. It doesn't work that way. We do it together. And so we don't have to worry about saying, oh, I'm in D.C. on the 2 days a year we can breathe the air and look across the street. We have the confidence of knowing that we have a quality of life, including the ability to see across the street and breathe the air, because in a civilized society, the greatest democracy in the world, we have made sure that those standards are there for our citizens. I remember a few years ago being on a trip to Russia, this was a few years ago now, where they were talking about wanting to get more private sector investment into Moscow, into Russia. Came home talking to our businesses, and they said, you know, the problem is they don't have a rule of law. We don't trust how we can invest there because we're not confident in their government, their rule of law. We don't have that problem here. We have the epitome of a system with checks and balances, a rule of law. Up until all of this has begun, we've had the confidence available in the private sector on how to invest and know that there is a system in place. I had the opportunity with my agriculture hat on a few months ago to be in Haiti, where we see a great desire, meeting with the Haitian president, to bring in more business and investment from the United States. Problem is, you bring a shipload of cargo into the harbor, you can't get it off the ship without paying bribes. They have no law enforcement system, judicial system, rule of law. That's not true in our country. We do it through something collectively that we call government, that creates a way for us to make sure we can drink the water and breathe the air and see across the street and drive on the roads and have the opportunity for education for all of our children. Know that you can walk into a restaurant and have some level of confidence that the food is safe, or go into the grocery store and know that. We have research institutions that suddenly, after our colleagues in the House have been saying, now for years I've had personal debates with folks that said, you know, we don't need a National Institute of Health. Let the private sector do it. And yet we know collectively we are willing to share a risk of basic research to try to find cancer cures, to go over and over again on research till you get that one that may be able to move forward and be successful, in which case the private sector comes in, takes it from there. But we have done it together and shared the risk because we know it's in all of our interests to save lives, our own, our family members, others, whether it's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, juvenile diabetes, cancer. All of those things are done collectively through this thing that we call government. That's why we have the best standard of living in the world. We're the wealthiest country in the world. We're the envy of the world. People want to come here and invest. They want to be a part of this opportunity in this country. And now we are debating whether or not, literally, there should be a public sector. Should we fund the police and the fire and the judicial system? And while there are those on the other side of the aisle who say, oh, no, we don't mean that. Every time we bring up something, oh, no, we didn't mean that. Well, I'm not sure what, Mr. President, they mean then in a civilized society. Now, we know that we have challenges around issues of finance and debt. As chair of the Agriculture Committee, I'm proud of the fact, I've said so many times on the floor, we're the only committee on a bipartisan basis that's actually brought a deficit reduction bill to the floor that is passed in the Senate. And so I take a backseat to no one when we are looking at ways to cut duplication, to cut things that aren't important, to strengthen those things that are, and to save money. But you do not do it by destroying our economy, by shutting down the services that we all count on to protect us as consumers, to make sure our children have opportunities, to make sure that we are safe and secure in this country. Obviously, that makes no sense. It's totally irresponsible. What we are not talking about enough is the fact that we have begun to see things happening in terms of the debt and deficit, and we can continue to do that. In fact, the yearly deficit's been cut in half. I don't hear people talking about that, but the numbers say that. We set a few years ago a goal of $4 trillion in debt reduction over 10 years, and we're more than halfway there. Not all the way there, but we have put in place the mechanisms through cuts, through new revenue, through interest savings, $2.5 trillion in debt reduction out of the $4 trillion. Now, what is happening today by shutting down the government and threatening a default, that debt's going to go back up. We're going to undermine the work we have already done by adding increased costs through interest payments and delays that will actually increase the debt. We saw that in the last go-around in 2011, even though there wasn't actually a default on the full faith and credit of the United States of America. We saw it because of exactly what's happening now. A lot of talk, in my judgment, some very irresponsible talk, posturing back and forth, instead of working together in a reasonable way. And we saw the markets affected, a drop of 2,000 points in the markets, $800 billion in retirement savings of folks who have worked hard all their lives or maybe are still working and can't figure out why in the world we can't work together in a reasonable, rational way to solve problems. $800 billion retirement savings gone. During that time in 2011, that summer, that July and August, anyone who was signing up for a new mortgage is paying on average $100 more a month in payments because the interest rates were higher. So instead of building on what we've already done together or even acknowledging it, may not make good politics to acknowledge folks on the other side of the aisle. They certainly don't want to give credit to the president or give credit to anything that we've actually been doing together, it seems, unfortunately. But the reality is the deficit's been cut in half, and we are more than halfway to the goal that was set for savings over 10 years. And there's nothing that's been happening in the last few days, shutting the government down, threatening possible default on the full faith and credit of the United States, that is helping us reach that goal. It is actually going in the opposite direction. Billions of dollars as interest rates go up will be added to the debt. So as we have tried to figure out over the last number of months how to continue bringing down the debt and tackling long-term challenges while, by the way, growing jobs, because the best way to get us out of debt is to create jobs so people can go back to work and be part of the economy. That's the best thing, and we're sure not hearing enough talk about that. I'm very proud to come from a state that makes things and grows things, and it's manufacturing that is bringing us back, that is driving the economy, and it's agriculture, where we have the biggest exports in terms of export surplus in the country. We need to make things and grow things, focus on that. That will bring down the debt as we create more opportunities and more jobs. But as we have tried in the last 6 months to go to a conference committee, negotiating team, formal negotiating process between the House and the Senate on a long-term budget, 10-year budget, that will bring more of the debt down, create jobs, do things in a fair and balanced way that puts middle-class families first. Well, we've been trying to do that, and as of today, 21 times the chair of the Budget Committee has come to the floor and moved that, in fact, we get to that process 21 times, joined by distinguished members of the Republican caucus in the Senate who've come to say the same thing. Let us go to a budget negotiation, a formal budget negotiation. 21 times, the same folks who shut the government down, the same folks that say, oh, really doesn't hurt anything if we default as a country, even though every economist, every business leader is begging and pleading and providing facts and information as to why it would be a complete disaster. The same people that are saying defaults don't matter, government doesn't work, except when they're reading something in the paper and somebody's saying that there's a problem. Those same people have 21 times been able to block the Senate from going to a formal negotiation with the House on the budget. So we're in this crazy place where, on the one hand, when you step back, we are actually seeing the economy slowly moving forward. Of course, until now, where it's beginning to be stymied by all of this, but the economy has been moving forward. The yearly deficit coming down. We have been tackling the long-term debt. We're coming out of this. And then we have a group of folks that have decided, in the big picture, that there is no value in a democracy, in the greatest country in the world, in government. They don't seem to care about what it takes to really provide an economy and so on. And now they are saying that they are willing to jeopardize the full faith and credit of the United States of America, have America default on our bills, and potentially send us not only and probably into a great recession like the one we just came out of, but economists tell us that it could send us back even further into the 30s or the 40s. They just don't know. We're in a global marketplace right now where we just don't know what happens when we default on our bills, when we lose the confidence in the world to invest in America or to even purchase our debt. We don't know what happens when small businesses see all their capital dry up and people are not able to get mortgage loans again, or they cost much, much more than they did before, and all the other ramifications of our not paying our bills. Now, there are colleagues that say, well, the Secretary of the Treasury, who, by the way, came in and gave an excellent job in the Finance Committee today. It was very serious, it was very sobering, but I thought he was clear and he was factual, and I very much appreciate his coming to the Senate Finance Committee. But there are those that say, well, he says October 17th is the last time that extraordinary measures can be used to stop us from falling off the cliff and going into a default and losing the full faith and credit of the United States. And some say, well, no, it could be the next day, it could be the day after. It reminds me, coming from a car state, it reminds me of somebody who is driving in their car and they look and it's on empty, and you know you may have a little bit more, right? You know, sometimes they tell you, you got 5 miles more, you got 10 miles more, maybe you have 30 miles more. But you're on empty, and you're going to stop. The car is going to stop. And the question is, how often do you really want to risk that and play that game when you know the car is going to stop? Well, that's the kind of, in my judgment, absurd and irresponsible debate that is going on right now about whether the car stops immediately or in 2 miles or 3 miles or 30 miles. Why in the world would you want to put yourself in that position? And Lord knows, defaulting on the full faith and credit of the United States of America is much more serious than running out of gas in your car. There is no reason for this. None. Zero. This is a manufactured crisis. Do we need to continue to work together to tackle the long-term debt of this country? Absolutely. Count me in. Do we need to focus on what's happening to middle-class families who are getting squeezed on all sides and have a hard time just holding on? Do we need to focus on jobs in this country, making things and growing things, and out-educating and out-innovating the world? Absolutely. Count me in. In fact, count me at the head of the line on that. And we in Michigan right now, in terms of our hard work and ingenuity and innovation, take a backseat to nobody. But to find ourselves in this craziness is beyond my understanding. And I know people at home are going, what in the world is going on here? Can't you guys just come together and figure this out and quit making up crises and quit creating artificial deadlines and get things done? I think it's important at this point in our history, Mr. President, that we remember President Ronald Reagan when he said, never before in our history has the federal government failed to honor its financial obligations. We are the greatest country in the world. Others look to us. They want to be like us. They want a vibrant middle class like America has had. We need to fight hard to keep ours and keep it growing. And we need to make sure that we do not fail to honor the financial obligations of this great country. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, thank you. And I just listened to my colleague from Michigan talking about the need to reopen government and the need for us to deal with the debt. Of course, I agree with that, as do my colleagues on this side of the aisle. We also heard discussion about the fact that we shouldn't be manufacturing crises. Unfortunately, we have a crisis on our hands, and that is the crisis of debt at record levels. And so I want to talk a little about that today and talk about why this discussion is so important, particularly on extending the debt limit, because that would be the place naturally for us to deal with the problem that faces this generation and certainly future generations, which is this historic level of debt. In a matter of days, we're told that our nation's going to be reaching this debt limit, which is $16.7 trillion. You think about that. That's, I think, 16,000 billion dollars. It's impossible to comprehend that number, but let's try. 16.7 trillion would produce a stack of $1 bills about a million miles high. A million miles high. That's enough, by the way, to go to the moon and back. And it's now bigger, by the way, than the size of our entire economy. Only once in our history we had debt that, as a percent of the economy, is so large, and that was right after World War II. And frankly, we were able quickly to address that. We didn't have the long-term liabilities we have now, and we had very high defense spending from World War II we were able to reduce. But other than that, we have never been here before, and I would say that we're in uncharted territory. And by the way, it's not just that we have this huge level of debt and deficit and the overhang on the economy, but it's the fact that the economy is also weak. I think they're related. I think this huge level of debt and deficit is like a wet blanket over the economy. Here's an interesting chart. It shows that the debt limit rising twice as fast as the economy has grown in the last 2 years. So the debt increase has gone up by about $2.4 billion. Unfortunately, our GDP increase has been less than half that. So that's the problem that we are trying to face here. It's a lot of back and forth, and I know for some people it looks like this is politics. It's not. It's about a fundamental issue, and there are fundamental disagreements, and I respect those disagreements. But we have to address this problem, and we have to do it in the context of the debt limit, and if we do not, we will simply be kicking the can down the road again and letting down the people we represent. If you divide that debt among the American people, each of us, every man, woman, and child in America, owes around $50,000. And by the way, of course, that's far more than the average annual per capita income for that man, woman, and child in America. So you think about that, it's about $140,000, $150,000 per household on average. That's where we've gotten to. And I don't think it's constructive to be pointing fingers of blame because, frankly, for decades, Republicans and Democrats alike have spent more money than the government takes in. More promises have been made than can be kept. And we have gone through a process of mortgaging the future for our kids and grandkids as a result. But here we are. I would say, in some respects, you could say the greatest single act of bipartisanship here in the United States Congress has been the overspending. So the question is not how we got here, but what are we going to do about it? Where are we going? The President yesterday said that raising the nation's credit limit by another $1 trillion really pays for last year's deficit spending, not next year's. I guess we could have that debate. I would say it's about the future because we're borrowing more money to pay the bills of the country going forward. And that's what many of us want to talk about, is how going forward we can reduce those bills. But the truth is, whether you say you're paying for the past or paying for the future, it really doesn't matter to the American people. And it doesn't matter to our children and grandchildren who end up paying the bill. Because long after we're gone, this huge level of debt and deficit is going to be something that they're going to have to deal with. But we all know the consequences if you don't raise the debt limit. Without a debt limit increase, the federal government's unable to borrow to meet its expenses. And because we're currently borrowing about 20 cents of every dollar the federal government spends, government would be unable to meet all of its obligations. There's been discussion about meeting the interest on the debt. That's only about 8% of revenue coming in. I assume that could be met. But it's true that there are other obligations that, frankly, can't be met if the government can't borrow, because the government's borrowing more than it's spending more than it takes in and needs to borrow to make up the difference. The deficit, some have said, including some of my colleagues on the other side today, is lower now, and somehow that's an indication that we're okay in terms of the deficit. I would just remind folks that the deficit this year is the 5th largest deficit in the history of our country, in our entire history. It's over $640 billion. And more significantly, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan group around here that analyzes this stuff, says it's temporary, that it's lower than $1 trillion. In other words, within a decade, they say it gets back up to $1 trillion. So, you know, whether it's $640 billion or $1 trillion, it's way too high. Entitlement spending, by the way, will push these annual deficits up to the equivalent of $3.4 trillion a year, 5 times what they are today, within a few decades. That's based on the Congressional Budget Office. At that point, by the way, the national debt would be 2.5 times as large as the entire economy. Again, today it's about the size of the economy. It's a little bigger. But it would be 2.5 times as large as our whole economy. And there's one CBO report I saw recently that simply stops calculating the interest cost at that point because they cannot foresee our economy functioning under those kinds of conditions. And think about your own family budget. Or think about your business. You couldn't function either. The bank wouldn't be able to lend you any money. Both of these outcomes, default today and bankruptcy in the future, are unacceptable. That's why it's time for us to work together to try to do something about them. As the debt ceiling is raised, it's time to address the underlying problem. That's what we're saying. And by the way, the American people are saying that too. Based on the polling I've seen this week, by better than a 2-to-1 margin, the American people are saying don't raise the debt limit without doing something about the spending. And they get it, because for them it is like the credit card. You know, when you reach the limit, you realize you have to do something about the underlying problem, which is how much you're spending. The President says pass the debt limit increase now and we'll address the spending later. I wish it were that simple. But I think he knows, as well as everyone in this chamber and every person who's watching at home today, that Congress simply doesn't reduce spending unless it's forced to do so. And if you don't think that's true, let me remind you of what the history is here. In the past 3 decades, I've gone back and looked at all these deficit reduction plans that did get through Congress. There aren't many, but there are some. Every single instance where there was any significant deficit reduction, it came as a result of what? A discussion about the debt limit. Because that's the time at which there's some pressure here in Congress to actually do something about it. I found one in 2005, a relatively small reduction of spending, but otherwise every single one of them, the Gramm-Rudman rescissions back in the 80s, the 1990 Andrews Air Force Base agreement that first President Bush conducted with Democrats, the 1993 balanced budget talks, the 1997 balanced budget agreement that Bill Clinton negotiated with Newt Gingrich, Democrat President, Republican Speaker. And of course, the PAYGO rules that many Democrats are fond of, those PAYGO rules came out of a debt limit discussion. And then finally, we have to look only a couple years ago to the Budget Control Act, where yes, as my colleague has said on the other side of the aisle, there have been some successes in reducing spending. On the discretionary side of the spending, that's about 1/3 of the budget that is appropriated here every year. That came out of the Budget Control Act, which is a result of what? The debt limit. In other words, members listening to the folks back home, and I'm listening to my constituents back home in Ohio right now on this, are saying, don't max out on the credit card again and go over the limit unless you do something about the problem. So it's little wonder that the American people, by this margin of 2-to-1 that I talked about, are saying, don't do it without the spending reductions. They know that's the only way that these cuts are likely to happen. Why is it that any increase in the debt limit should also include pro-growth provisions? Well, because one way you get at the debt and deficit, of course, is spending restraint, and we talked about the discretionary spending being about 35% of the budget. We've made progress there. The other 65% of the budget is the mandatory spending side. There we have not made progress. The other part would be revenue, and the first of this year, taxes were raised by $620 billion. What we have not done is deal with the mandatory side. But then finally, of course, economic growth helps. So we should also, as we are extending the debt limit, look at how we can help give the economy a shot in the arm. Tax reform is the way to do that. And there's a consensus here in this body, I think, that we need to do it. That would seem to make sense as well. So we have already made progress on one of the 3 legs of the stool, which is dealing with the discretionary spending. Pretty much been flat the last couple of years. For the first time, by the way, since the 1950s, actually a reduction in spending for 2 years in a row. But that's only 35% of the budget. The fastest growing part, again, 65% of the budget we have not dealt with. And by the way, That 65% grows to 76% of the budget in the next 10 years, based on the Congressional Budget Office. On the tax side, by the way, the same Congressional Budget Office tells us that starting in 2014, that's next year around the corner, taxes as a percent of our economy will be above its historic level. So in other words, there'll be more taxes coming in from the tax increases, in part, that were passed earlier this year. But the part that we have not dealt with, again, is mandatory spending. It's the biggest part of our spending. It's the fastest growing part of our spending. And it's politically difficult to deal with. Let's face it. But that's what we're hired to do. That's what we were hired to do. And that's what the President was hired to do in terms of providing leadership. With Obamacare, of course, we've added a new health entitlement program to this part of the budget, the 65%. Already, by the way, these health entitlements were growing more quickly than the rest of the budget, even the rest of mandatory spending. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that in the next 10 years, the health entitlement programs grow by over 100%. These are vital programs, Medicare and Medicaid, but they've got to be reformed so that they are sustainable into the future, and they're there for our kids and grandkids. With 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day and health care costs continuing to rise, we've got a real problem here. We have to address it. All of us know that. All of us, Democrat, Republican alike, the President, the Congress. And again, history tells us the best way is to link this with the debt limit, because that's the opportunity and has traditionally been the opportunity to make progress here. By the way, over the long term, overall revenues projected to increase, discretionary spending is projected to be flat. The entire increase in our deficit, these huge debts and deficits going forward that I talked about, are due to the mandatory spending. Again, that's the Congressional Budget Office, not me. A good place to start, of course, would be some of the mandatory spending reforms the President himself has proposed. That would seem to be less controversial. If they're in the President's budget, that means he supports them. And the President sent a budget up this year. And he included over $700 billion of spending reforms over here on the mandatory side of the budget. This is why what I've been advocating is, let's start there. Let's look at the President's own proposals. These are not the proposals that all Republicans support. But after all, we should have a negotiation. This notion that the President says he refuses to negotiate, that's never been true. Every President has negotiated. And I think the American people are confused by this. How could the President of the United States say, in the context of this debt limit discussion, that he refuses to even talk to the other side? That makes no sense. President Bush, one, rolled up his sleeves. We talked about the 1990 agreements. President Clinton rolled up his sleeves. We talked about it, the 1997 balanced budget agreement he negotiated with then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. This is what presidents do. We need them to lead, particularly on these tough issues. As we talked about earlier, these are politically tough issues. The President says he doesn't want to be held hostage over the debt limit. He's not. He's been given the opportunity to lead using his own proposals. At least that's my suggestion. We can also take a very simple step as we're going through this to be sure that this newest health care entitlement, which is what the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare is, it's a new entitlement program, doesn't become even more of a deficit driver than many of us on this side fear it will already be. The Affordable Care Act includes a provision that requires that when you get your subsidies under the exchanges, that you have to verify your income. Makes sense. You have to verify your income between 100% of poverty and 400% of poverty. Below that, it would be Medicaid. Above that, it would be the subsidies under the exchanges. Under a final regulation that the administration put out, they said that, well, we know you should verify your income, that's what the law says, but we're going to give all the exchanges another year to do it, not till 2015. Well, obviously the concern there is that that will be an invitation for fraud and for waste and for big new expenses. As a result, the federal government body in charge of this, the CMS, came out and said, no, we'll do it for federal exchanges. We'll require people to verify their income, but not for state exchanges. Well, there are about 17 states and the District of Columbia that have state exchanges. And they've said to them, you guys can wait. In fact, not just till 2015, but there's no date certain on that. So that certainly should be something that we, as United States Congress here, should deal with. The Democrats in the chamber here who voted for the Affordable Care Act certainly should support, because the intent of the bill when they signed up for it and when the President supported it was, of course, that you would verify your income. So that's an example of a simple step we could take to prevent the distribution of subsidies until we have a system to verify that those subsidies are going to the right people. Finally, let's give the economy a shot in the arm. And as part of this process, let's do a step forward and say, let's reform the tax code. We're going to differ about the details, but let's get started on it. So my proposal would be, as we have a vote on extending the debt limit, let's do these important reforms we talked about on the mandatory side, but let's also commit to tax reform. Let's force the process. Let's facilitate it. Let's expedite it. Because the American people are not looking just for us to get the spending under control. They want to see this economy growing. Again, they're not happy with this, where the debt's increasing at twice the rate of the economy. What they want to see is opportunities for their kids to get a job. What they want to see is the opportunity to have the dignity and self-respect that comes with a job. And we know that tax reform done properly will be pro-growth. It will create jobs. Again, we're going to differ on some of the details. That's okay. Let's get started on it. Now, perhaps the President doesn't think that spending and the deficits are a real problem. If he thinks that, he should say it. He says just the opposite. He has said he does think that it's necessary for us to address these problems. In fact, again, in his own budget, he has sent proposals forward. So what we need to do is get together and negotiate and talk and deal with this underlying problem. A debt that's nearly $17 trillion is unacceptable to everybody, I hope. And I would think you would welcome the sign that Republicans are giving now that we want to negotiate, we want to talk. Negotiations, by the way, I don't think are a sign of weakness. I don't think coming to the table is a signal of a failure of leadership. I think just the opposite. I think that shows strength and shows leadership. Again, I can promise you Republicans don't support all of President Obama's suggested savings in his budget, and a purely Republican debt limit agreement would look very different from whatever plan might emerge from bipartisan negotiations. But again, the American people sent us here to get stuff done. Using President Obama's own proposals, let's take that first step toward entitlement and pro-growth tax reform and onto some common ground to break the gridlock in D.C. and finally do something positive about that underlying problem that we all acknowledge. Yes, we face serious problems, real challenges, but we also have an opportunity here to do something positive, to deal with the problem we all acknowledge, something that will not only prevent a debt limit crisis today, but a debt crisis tomorrow. Mr. President, I hope we'll move forward in that important project. I think we owe it to the people we represent. I yield back my time.
Mr. President,
The senator from North Dakota.
October 1st was a significant day. Two things happened to the constituents of my state. The first we talk a lot about here, and that is basically the shutdown of government, the failure to pass a continuing resolution that would keep the doors of government open for the thousands and thousands of Americans and North Dakotans who depend on government services. Had a horrible impact, continues to have a horrible impact, continues to have consequences that people didn't really foresee. But the second thing that happened that hasn't gotten a lot of attention is the expiration of a long-term farm bill. You know, we had been negotiating. This body, in a large bipartisan vote, was able to accommodate the concerns, come together, negotiate, come up with a package that had real reform, eliminated direct payments, did real reform in the SNAP program, streamlined conservation programs, and basically offered $25 billion of debt relief to the country. Great package. Sent it over to the House, waited for the House to pass their farm bill. Initially couldn't pass the farm bill, then they decided to divide the farm bill, pass part of the farm bill, pass the other part of the farm bill with nutrition. Now had a vote to bring them back together, and we're patiently waiting the appointment of a conference committee. Mr. President, the passage of the farm bill has never been a partisan issue. In fact, it's a regional issue. Things that are good for North Dakota may not be good for Mr. President's state, Delaware, but we all work together and we all compromise and we all come together. This past weekend, South Dakota, southwestern North Dakota were hit with a terrible snowstorm. Over 2 days, that region was blanketed anywhere from 2 to 7 feet of snow and contained winds over 70 miles an hour. Because of the early storm, thousands, tens of thousands of cattle died because they were suffocated, mired, and drowned in stock dams and dropped from exhaustion. The pictures and the stories are devastating. This image is one that's all too common after the recent blizzard in the Dakotas. These cattle that died over the weekend near Hettinger, North Dakota, were owned by the Chrisman family. Like many North Dakota ranchers, this hard-working family lost many cows and calves during this surprise fall storm. What people may not understand about the cattle industry is you might think one cow is like the next cow. You can just replace them. These herds are the product of years and years of selective breeding, years and years of working to improve the quality of their herd and to meet different specifications in the market. They're more than cows. They contain an intellectual property component that is not easily replaced. Now, this is where the dysfunction, the crisis of the dysfunction that is Washington, D.C., meets natural disaster. When livestock die from a natural disaster, farmers report the number of cattle that died to the Farm Service Agency, FSA. However, because the doors are closed on the federal government, North Dakota ranchers, South Dakota ranchers, anyone who is experiencing livestock losses have no place to report those losses. And even worse, they have no one at USDA to consult with about the information they need to collect to eventually report their claims. This is critical information. If farmers aren't collecting the information that they need to make disaster claims in the future, the safety nets that were put in place to provide some support to these hardworking ranchers may be denied simply because of a paperwork error. Unfortunately, this is an avoidable problem. Like so many in recent years, it's the product of congressional dysfunction. Because we haven't passed a new farm bill, the livestock program that helps ranchers withstand losses to livestock herds due to extreme weather events, the Livestock Indemnity Program, well, that's expired. And the Emergency Assistance for Livestock and Honeybee Producers Program, which is in the yet stalled Farm Bill, which helps producers stay in business after they experience significant losses because of natural disasters, isn't available to the ranchers and the beekeepers who were hit the hardest by the storm. Until Congress passes a farm bill, livestock producers are in danger of losing their business, and they will not be eligible for support. These ranchers and the farm bill are just more collateral damage from the government shutdown. Because we're debating whether to fund the federal government or not, Congress isn't able to work on a farm bill. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting for the appointment of conferees. We were told, the chairwoman, I think she intends to make a floor speech about the farm bill yet today. The chairwoman has been working very hard to encourage the collection of information and to encourage the appointment of conference committee and get focused on this issue. Unfortunately, it's not happening until next week, if it even happens then. In addition, the lack of assistance for ranchers in the aftermath of this devastating storm, the shutdown is hurting farmers and agricultural industries, which is a key piece of North Dakota's economy. Here are some additional examples of where the shutdown is hurting our farmers. Frequently, because farmers who use FSA loans have a joint obligation with FSA, when they receive their checks, when they sell their products, the checks are frequently made out to both the Farm Service Agency and the farmer themselves. Consequently, you can't cash the check unless you can get an endorsement from the Farm Service Agency. Guess what? They go to knock on the door and no one's there to co-sign their check. So that money in their hand that they need to make the investments for next year, that they need to pay the person who maybe supplies the feed, that they need to pay the fuel bill, that money is not available to them, even though they've earned it and they've paid and they've sold their products. So the government shutdown prevents FSA from cashing these checks and from signing these checks. This is money that the farmers have earned and they deserve, and denying them their income is outrageous. What's worse, farmers and ranchers enrolled in the loan programs are new and beginning farmers, farmers who are just starting out. A great thing that's happening in the Dakotas and all across farm country as we look at the increasing commodity prices and we look at a farm program that for the last 5 years has been stable and provided real risk management, our farmers are getting younger and younger. The people who are going to feed the world and continue to develop our rural areas are younger and younger. They cannot withstand cash flow problems. They cannot withstand this loss. Another impact of the shutdown. Agricultural reports from the National Agricultural Statistics Service aren't available to farmers. These reports are crucial resources that farmers need to make decisions, such as how to price crops, which commodities to grow, and when to sell those commodities, and the reports enable farmers to track cattle auction prices. Not only has NASS stopped putting out new reports about demand and supply, export and prices, but all websites with past information have been taken down because of the government shutdown. Farmers aren't receiving assistance from farm programs. The Department of Agriculture local farm service offices have been shut down because of the shutdown, and as a result, farmers can't apply for new loans, sign up for acreage for farm programs, or receive government checks for the programs they're already enrolled in. Devastating to so many of our people living on fixed incomes in North Dakota who have engaged and basically put their land into the Conservation Reserve Program is Conservation Reserve checks are not being issued. That has a huge impact, particularly on those ranchers and those landowners who use CRP payments to supplement their Social Security. The list goes on, and as time continues, this list will only get longer and longer. And I understand the strategy, perhaps, in the House is to, whatever is on the headline of the day, whatever becomes the issue of the day, we'll just simply write a little mini CR to take care of that and say, see, we're dealing with that issue. But we know it's only a slice. It's only a slice. It doesn't take care of those small businesses who have applied for small business loans and maybe got this close to being able to realize their dream and now have it increased. It doesn't deal with the critical functions of government in its entirety. Instead, it just picks and chooses the winners and losers. And let me tell you, these ranchers who have experienced this loss, they're the losers under this system. It is time for this organization and this Congress to begin and to do the responsible thing, which is open government up, fund all of government, and start telling the American people that their interest is paramount. Start telling farmers and ranchers in the Dakotas who have experienced this tremendous loss that we care about their loss, that these programs have to work for them, and we have to do everything that we can to make sure that America is working again. I want to close with one thought. In the Great Recession, one place where we've experienced a tremendous amount of opportunity and support has been in agriculture. Those states that had a good agricultural base had some of the lowest unemployment numbers in the country. 16 million jobs depend on agriculture in this country. And all they ask for in return is a little bit of help, a little bit of a safety net for guaranteeing a food supply in this country. But we can't seem to even deliver that obligation. We can't seem to deliver that promise. We have got to tell the American people that their interest is ahead of any petty or partisan interest in this body and in this Congress. We have got to get the Congress back working for the American people, particularly for the hard-hit ranchers and farmers of southwestern North Dakota and of West River, South Dakota. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, here we are again at the same crossroads. We know the landmarks. We know the signs. We've been here before. We negotiated in good faith to avert the last shutdown, the last default threat. We imposed the sequester, but that wasn't enough. So here we are once again, and here we will be again in a week, a month, 6 months, a year, being asked for more concessions to a minority of extreme Republicans who seem to have forgotten that we operate under the rule of law. They simply have chosen to ignore it. The fact is, we passed the Affordable Care Act. It went through the legislative process, was signed by the President, tested by the Supreme Court. But so what? They say it doesn't count. Like the schoolyard bully, they want a do-over or they'll take over your lunch money. The right-wing Republican minority claims to love the Constitution, adheres to the strictest interpretation of its tenets, but apparently is not interested in living by it or by the rule of law that this nation stands for and lives by. They say Democrats have failed to negotiate in good faith and voted against trying to reach a compromise. Well, the fact is, for 6 months, Senate Republicans have stood in the way of budget negotiations, what they want, negotiations, by blocking requests for budget committee members to conference with the House of Representatives. They've objected over 20 times to those budget negotiations. The Senate followed regular order and passed a budget resolution for fiscal year 2014 on March the 23rd of this year. Our budget resolution provides just over $1 trillion by replacing the irresponsible sequestration cuts while following the spending limit imposed by the Budget Control Act. The House wants to keep sequestration cuts by funding the government at $976 billion, or about $80 billion less than the Senate. The fact is, we've already compromised with the House by agreeing to a continuing resolution at a level of $986 billion, much closer to their numbers than to ours. So if you ask me, that's more than $70 billion in compromising. But they simply won't take yes for an answer. What the past weeks have shown us is that this isn't even about budget numbers. They just want to make a political point, and they're holding the country hostage in order to make it. They simply do not want either the Affordable Care Act, or for that fact, this president, to succeed. But that train has left the station. The president is already turning the economy around from the massive deficits he inherited when he took office, and the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. So make no mistake, it's not a coincidence that we are here again doing the same thing, much like Groundhog Day. And mark my words, we will be here again tomorrow and in the future if the Republican shutdown strategy continues. We are being asked to capitulate yet again at the threat that Republicans will keep the government shut down, that they will force America to default on its obligations and risk a global consequence in America's leadership role in the world. It is a deliberately I should say, if fatally flawed Republican strategy. One might go so far as to call it a conspiracy, adopted to achieve through bullying what they cannot achieve at the ballot box. We know it is a deliberate effort hatched many months ago. In fact, it goes back to 2010 when the House Republicans threatened to push the nation into defaulting on its obligations and shut down the government unless we agreed to aggressive and deep structural cuts that met their political objectives in the midst of one of the deepest recessions in our history, a recession that President Obama inherited when he took office. Then in November of 2010, the anti-tax, anti-government, anti-spending, anti-progress side of the Republican Party exercised their newfound power and hamstrung their leadership into rejecting any kind of compromise, forcing the House Speaker and Majority Leader to reject any grand bargain proposed by the Democrats. And they did it gleefully. It was part of their strategy to block any successful effort to actually govern. They chose instead to fuel the right-wing flames, burn the House down, and bring government to a halt until they achieved their objectives. From December 2nd to December 21st of 2010 of that year, we enacted 4 separate continuing resolutions to keep the government open. 4 of them to keep the government functioning until March the 4th. And let's not forget that these appropriations actually cut the Congressional Budget Office's projection of discretionary spending from 2013 through 2022 by $400 billion. But that wasn't enough. They wanted more. On March the 2nd of 2011, as the new deadline approached, we passed another short-term CR, taking us to March 18th, just 16 days, that cut spending by yet another $4 billion. Still not enough. On March 16th, the deadline approaching once again, we passed another continuing resolution, taking us to April 8th, with another $6 billion in spending cuts. Was it enough? Of course not. On April the 4th, House Republicans applauded the Speaker's announcements to begin preparations for what? Yes, a shutdown of the government. Clearly, nothing is enough. On April 14th, just before midnight, the Speaker agreed to the 7th short-term extension with more cuts than anticipated amount to an additional $350 million in that year alone. All in all, we agreed to $40 billion in total cuts. Even more something called the Williamsburg Accord. January this year, towards a potential federal government shutdown and possibly towards provoking a sovereign debt crisis after that, you need to understand that this is the inevitable product of a conscious party strategy. His article goes on to say the way that we have planned since January to force Obama to accede to large chunks of the Republican agenda without Republicans having to offer any policy concessions of their own. That's not negotiation, Mr. President. And we saw the implementation of that strategy beginning early in the spring when we did exactly what Republicans wanted. We passed the budget in the Senate, and the House passed a budget, and we attempted to go to conference to work out the difference between the two. Actually, we've attempted to do that more than 20 times now, and every single time Republicans have blocked action. For 6 months, they have refused to talk. They've refused to negotiate. They've refused to have a conversation. As we now know, this all was planned out from the beginning, going back to their January Williamsburg Accord. They've intentionally driven us to the edge of the cliff to serve their own political interests at the expense of the nation's economy, the jobs of working families, and the retirement savings of our seniors. Now the GOP's solution to get us out of this Republican shutdown is the equivalent of whack-a-mole. It's their form of governing. Whatever issue pops up that they see a problem with as a result of their shutdown, they draft a bill to address a single issue. Last week it was national parks. This week it was death benefits for soldiers. What will it be next? And anyone who's ever been on the boardwalk and played that arcade game of whack-a-mole knows you can never quite get ahead of those pesky moles that keep popping up. How long do they plan to govern by this way? Bill Moyers recently wrote in an essay, and I quote, "Despite what they say, Obamacare is only one of their targets. Before they will allow the government to reopen, they demand employers be enabled to deny birth control coverage to female employees. They demand Obama cave on the Keystone Pipeline. They demand the watchdogs over corporate pollution be muzzled and the big bag regulators of Wall Street sent home. Their ransom list goes on and on. The debt ceiling is next." At least let's name this for what it is: sabotage of the democratic process. Kevin Drum of Mother Jones wrote, quote, "How do you get across how insurrectionary this is? Raising the debt ceiling isn't a concession from Republicans that deserves a corresponding concession from Democrats. It's the financial equivalent of a nuclear bomb." And Warren Buffett used equally stark terms when he said in Fortune magazine, quote, "It ought to be banned," referring to defaulting on the nation's obligations. "It ought to be banned as a weapon. It should be like nuclear bombs, basically too horrible to use." Clearly, in the name of some misguided allegiance to an extreme ideology, a handful of ultra-conservative extremists in the Republican Party are putting at risk the rule of law. They are putting at risk the full faith and credit of the United States, America's influence, as well as our obligations around the world, and our national security, embassy security, intelligence collection apparatus, American diplomats, foreign service officers, contractors serving in posts around the world. Mr. President, this is not a game. Real people are already being hurt by these tactics. And I find it pathetic that some Republicans are willing to risk the full faith and credit of this nation and inflict unnecessary harm on hard-working families and put the very principles of this democracy on the line, all just to show how ideologically pure they are. It's one thing to come to Washington wanting to destroy your government. It's quite another to destroy our economy in the process. If you want to negotiate, let's negotiate. Let's do it constructively, in good faith, and without threats. Let's try, as we've tried over 20 times, to get to that moment. Let's reopen the government, let's pay our bills, and then we'll negotiate. It's time to reject the schoolyard bully political strategy that Republicans hatched up months ago. Ratchet down the rhetoric and do the hard work of solving problems together. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and observe the absence of a quorum.